For last few days, we have covered quite a long ground, and those were the formative years and also the years which trained or equipped Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar to face and solve the great problem that millions of Indians or millions of people, we have seen that he had quite a lot of exposure of situations, starting from experiences of discrimination and caste-based treatment that we saw in his childhood. Then we saw that particular atmosphere or the ambience continued to be around him till the time he left for the United States. And in the United States, he studied very hard. He equipped himself with knowledge, with lot of skills, with lot of aptitude. And then he went to England to study further for his MSc and for his bar at law. And from England he has to come back because his scholarship was abruptly, the scholarship ended because it was a 3 years contract. So he had to come back to India. And he lived for some time in India, and during that period of time he participated in various social programs. He even started a newspaper in that period and gave the evidence before the franchise committee. And upon initiating some kind of social projects or social programs, he went back to England to finish his studies. And after finishing his studies, he came back to India in 1923. So if we look at his journey from his childhood till the age of 32, we can find that it has the clear-cut impressions of a person or what kind of a person was in making. So he have had quite an intense training and knowledge of wide-ranging issues. But he was not an idealist person, because he believed in the role of intelligence in changing the society, and therefore he tried to understand the situation and cultivate certain attitudes or certain tendencies or activated certain movements to look forward towards what can be done and not backwards. So he has a training in understanding the situation in order to look forward and not backward. And the reality of the situation was to be found in the reality of the experiences around him. And the reality of the experiences around him was that of discrimination, was that of exploitation, was that of degradation of the humanity by the caste system. So that was the reality of the experiences around him. And therefore he looked at that particular kind of a situation as something inhuman, something problematic, and therefore he, understanding the realities of the experiences or realities of the society around him, he devised certain methods to solve the series of problems that were lying ahead of him. And therefore, if we look at the movement or the approach of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, it was always innovative. It was very grounded in the reality of the situation or the reality of the experiences around And it has, his movement has the dynamism of innovativeness, of creativity, and of experiments. And if we look at his kind of arrival at this juncture, it was not from the vacuum that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar emerged or his knowledge emerged, but it was evolved, his knowledge was evolved from whatever was happening till that particular point of time in the history of not only India but of the world. So he was equipped to make use of all the knowledge that was available to him, which was evolved due to the evolution of humanity, the evolution of knowledge till that point of time. And that's why we find in Dr. Babasaheb's approach very concrete, realistic, innovative and peaceful methods in order to solve the problems that were facing the humanity which surrounded him. So he was very well prepared to undertake a very creative task of liberating the people who were discriminated as the untouchables. Not only that, but he had access to a wide-ranging knowledge reservoir that has arisen due to the progress of humanity and the evolution of humanity. So we can say in a word that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar was a person looking forward towards getting certain results, but not looking backwards in order to innovate something which will be against the development of the humanity in the future. So with this background, with this kind of a training in law, in philosophy, in politics, in economics, with this kind of a training, Dr. Ambedkar came back to India in 1923. When he came back to India, we know that he walked from Dadar railway station to Parel. And it was a very difficult time for him because the poverty never left him. Though he was a man of high erudition, he was a very educated man, but because of the conditions and the social structure around him, it was very difficult for him to have a good job. And therefore, he wanted to practice the law. And during that period, he wrote a very touching letter to Maharaja of Kolhapur, Shah Maharaj, that he had no money even to buy the court. He had no money even to register himself as a practicing lawyer in the court. Because in order to acquire the sanad, you have to pay a certain amount. And he had no money even to pay to acquire the sanad to practice in the court. He had no money. So he went down to his near and dear friend Naval Bhatena and borrowed some money from him so as to get a sanad to practice in the court of law. His life must be very busy that time, and because he was very concerned with the society and with the social transformation, he was also trying to create a kind of narration. He was also trying to understand the situation and communicate in a very clear terms to his people. And in order to do that, he started one organization in 1924, which is called Bahishkrit Hitakarani Sabha. He started this organization in 1924 with clearly laid down agenda. Because he was a man who was equipped with the knowledge, he was equipped with the mind that will penetrate and understand and clarify to the people in general in a very clear terms what was the reality of the time. So he wrote a pamphlet and he explained the principles of his peaceful social revolution in that pamphlet, and he encouraged people across the communities to join Bahishkrit Hitakarni Sabha. And in that he very clearly defined the future of his action. So he said that the Indian society is based on two principles, and those principles were based on birth and purity. So according to birth, there are the privileged and underprivileged people, and on the basis of purity notion, there are people who are impure and pure. And based on these two principles, there are three classes of people in the Indian society. According to these two principles, a principle based on the birth and a principle based on the notion of purity, there are three categories of people in this country. So the number one category was the category of the Brahmins, who had higher privileges based on their birth, and also they were considered to be pure. So he applied very clearly the two principles, the principles of the birth and the principle of the notion of purity and impurity. So the Brahmins had the superior position based on their birth, and also they were considered to be pure. And then there was another category which Dr. Ambedkar very clearly defined, which was called Brahmanetar, non-Brahmins. Now these non-Brahmins were not superior by birth, but they were considered as the pure human beings. They were not considered to be impure. And the third category that he defined based on these two principles is Bahishkrit, or the ostracized people, or the excommunicated people. And the people falling in this last category were inferior by birth and were impure. So birth and purity were the two principles Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar very clearly used in order to create three categories. And those categories were not created out of the blue. They existed in the society, even they exist today in the society on these very two principles. The principle of the birth and the principle of the purity or impurity. And he clearly defined that his Sabha or his organization is directed at the welfare of the third category of the people, which can be called the Bahishkrit. Okay. And he had a terrific insight into the social society. Terrific insight. What he said about the Brahmanetar or the non-Brahmins is very important. He said that they will rise one day because they can have access to knowledge, education, wealth. So he predicted that the Brahmanetar or the non-Brahman class of the people will rise one day. That's what he predicted. Because they have the position, they have the wealth, they have the access to knowledge. So he predicted that the category of the non-Brahmins will rise one day. And he said that it's very difficult for the people in the Bahishkrit or ostracized section of the society to rise, because there is an element of pessimism. There is an element of pessimism. There is an element of indiscipline. There is an element of not having access to the sources of knowledge, to the wealth and to the positions of power. So he found that it's very difficult for them to really rise. And I think this is very important, the way Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar created this narration based on the facts. We can see a great mind working in order to really create this kind of social categories, and based on not the experiences but based on the principles. Lots of organizations prior to the foundation of Bahishkrit Hitakarni Sabha were working on the reformation of the families. But Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar made it very clear that this organization is aimed at reformation of the society. So the Bahishkrit Hitakarni Sabha was the first organization in the realistic and the concrete terms aimed at social reformation. Because we see that by 1923, though Congress has taken the issue of untouchability on their agenda, came 1923, they forgot the issue of fighting against the untouchability. They forgot the whole issue because they wanted to use the ostracized people in India to further their political consolidation. And came 1923, they forgot everything about this issue. So Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar had very clearly laid down principles about the Bahishkrit or the third category of the people, and he didn't stop there because he was a public educator. He was a great teacher. As we have seen that he also taught. So he knew the importance of teaching those principles. So he conducted meetings in Barashi in Solapur district. He conducted meeting in Nipani and in Satara district, Rahmat. So what we can see is that a great mind is not just creating knowledge. He is not just creating knowledge, but he is also making efforts to disseminate that knowledge to the people at large. So he is involved in the public education. He is teaching to the masses as to what is wrong with this society, how it is based on the birth and on the notion of purity and impurity, and because it is based on these two principles, how three categories arise naturally from these two principles. He is not keeping that knowledge for himself, because it's not the knowledge that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar created, but because of his very powerful mind, he has observed it. And it's not just his experience, so he is trying to get the stamp of all the people on the experience that he narrated in terms of this narration. It's very important. Clearly talking in terms of the social reforms before the political reforms. So Bahishkrit Hitakarni Sabha, which was founded in 1924, which was the first organization that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar founded, started the hostels for the high school students. A hostel was started in Solapur. So you can see that he is already diversified. He has started some activities in Solapur. He has started free reading rooms through this organization, Bahishkrit Hitakarni Sabha, in Bombay. He started through this Sabha Mahar Hockey Club, so that the youths whose energy is being wasted on not so useful things can be utilized, can be disciplined, so that they can become the better human beings and serve their society. So you can see how the things are coming up. So with the foundation of Bahishkrit Hitakarni Sabha, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar very concretely launched a movement with clear-cut agenda, with clear-cut future, with clear-cut program. But as we know that the external situations are different, so he has to change, he has to engage with the time. But the definite strategy that was formed in 1924 continued throughout the life of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. Now he was trained in economics, so when the Royal Commission on Indian Currency and Finance came to India from England, Dr. Ambedkar was examined on that committee because he was considered to be a giant in the field of economics. So the Royal Commission, which was appointed by the British government, examined Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, and he took his evidence in 1925. As I said in the beginning, that he started practicing in Bombay. He got a sanat. It was very difficult for him to get a sanat because he has no money. And there is a very interesting episode that happened, and I am going to narrate that to you. There was a lawsuit against 3 leaders of the non-Brahman movement. There was a non-Brahman movement in Maharashtra. There were the 3 leaders who wrote a pamphlet against the Brahmins, and their names were Bagade, Jedhe, Javadkar. They were very great leaders of that time of the non-Brahman movement. And the Brahmins went to court and they brought a suit against these 3 leaders of the non-Brahman movement. The Brahmins appointed a very great lawyer from Pune from the prosecution side, and his name was L.B. Bhopatkar. L.B. Bhopatkar. His name was L.B. Bhopatkar. And Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar fought for the leaders of the non-Brahman movement. And then the course went on, the case went on, and ultimately that case was won by Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar won that case for the leaders of the non-Brahman movement, Bagade, Jedhe, Javadkar, in 1926. And that was a great victory for the society and for him personally. That was a great victory because they were the leaders of the non-Brahman movement, implicated by the Brahmins, saying that they have been trying to defame them. They brought a pamphlet against us. And in when the case was fought in the court of law, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar stood in defense of these 3 non-Brahman leaders, and he won the case in 1926. At the age of 35, he won the case. So this case had a very dramatic impact on his practice. So this case was not just kind of a criminal case or a case or the civil case. It was a case which had the social implications. It has the implications political, and he won that case. But practicing is very difficult. You many a times you don't get a lot of cases. So it's a very good profession for those who can get a lot of clients. But for the person like Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, who was so much talented in law, even then it was very difficult for him to get lawyers. And therefore his guru, Dada Keluskar, again came to help him, and he tried to get a job of a teacher for Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar in the Elphinstone College. Tried to get a job with the help of his friend Paranjape. Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar declined. He said that I don't want any job like this because I want to put myself in the service of my society, and I want time for that. And therefore he said he declined to get any permanent job. Very significant. He could have got a permanent salary from that job, but he declined and he declared that he no longer wants to have a permanent job. As I was telling you, that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar very clearly formulated his strategy to uplift the Bahishkrit or the ostracized people of India. And he said that the social structure must be constructed on three principles, and those three principles are valid even today. He said that there should be equality, there should be a sense of helping each other in the society, and there should be social harmony. Without these three principles, a peaceful social structure cannot arise, and it's still valid. And he was talking about why it is not possible in India to have kind of a revolution of the magnitude of the France or the magnitude of America. He quoted saying that there was a French Revolution which lasted for 10-15 years for equality, and there was a revolution in America where the Americans fought with each other for 6 years, which is called the American Civil War, and the issue was the abolition of slavery. But he said that no signs of such revolution can be found in the Indian context. Though there is so much of discrimination, so there is so much of hatred. So instead of having a permanent job in the Elphinstone College, which Dada Keduskar helped him to get, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar took a part-time lectureship in the Bartley Boy Accountancy Training Institute. He took a part-time lectureship in an institute called Bartley Boy Accountancy Training Institute, and he taught mercantile law. So you can understand the range of his understanding of very many laws. So he was not trained in the criminal cases. We can see that he also fought the criminal cases, civil suits. And here he is teaching the students the mercantile law. The law about the commerce and trade he is teaching in the Bartley Boy Accountancy Training Institute for the part-time, starting from June 1925 to 26. This was also a period of suffering for him. He suffered quite a lot during this period. If we can look at Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar's life, we can see that the suffering was ever present in his life, ever present. His daughter Indu and Rajaratna, they were born in the 20s. Rajaratna, who was a very dear child to Babasaheb Ambedkar, died in 1926. And the letter that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar wrote to his friend is very touching account of what was going on in his mind. The kind of suffering that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar was undergoing at that period of time. So when his dear child died, his life was full of suffering. He suffered quite a lot in 1926. His daughter Indu also died. So we can imagine the kind of suffering that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar was going at that period of time. But he was choosing a life for himself which can make him more and more available to his people. He is denying a regularly paid job. His family life is full of suffering. His life is beset with the poverty, but he is very focused. He is visiting the places, he is meeting the people here, he is telling them what is the important part that they have to play. In the Bombay Municipal Corporation, there was kind of a discussion going on about throwing the public reservoir for the public use. There should not be any discrimination in having access to the water from the common reservoirs or the common water tanks. And Bole, S.K. Bole, was the leader of the non-Brahman movement. He was putting some resolutions for discussion in the Bombay Legislative Assembly, and he made passed a resolution in 1923, and also he got the final resolution passed in 1926, which became a basis for Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar to launch his first mass movement. So that was happening in the backdrop. Babasaheb Ambedkar is trying to think about or trying to act in a way that will awaken the masses. So he found that the organization is very important. Starting the hostels are very important because that is the way by which he can give more and more access to education to his people. But also he found that it's very important to have the mouthpiece of his organization. He found it absolutely necessary, as it is said, that the bird can't fly without wings, a leader can't move without the newspaper. And therefore, in 1927, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar founded a fortnightly called the Bahishkrit Bharat. His vision is very clear. He is not talking about Bahishkrit Maharashtra or Bahishkrit Bombay or Bahishkrit Central Province. He is talking about Bahishkrit Bharat. Though that newspaper was in Marathi, it has the connotation, it has the national connotation, as we can clearly see from the title of the newspaper. So here, there was a newspaper that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar started, which was called the Mukanayak, which landed in difficulty because of a very rogue editor, D.D. Golab, and also because of the fact that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar has to go to England to complete his education. He came back and he launched, when he found suitable support to him, a newspaper, a fortnightly newspaper called Bahishkrit Bharat in 1927. In this particular paper, he was emphasizing more and more on two themes, justice and democracy. Now this word democracy was unheard to the masses in India. This word democracy was unheard. But Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar is talking about justice and democracy through his newspaper, Bahishkrit Bharat. So we can see that he has launched his struggle on the two fronts by 1927. Just within 4 years or 3 years of his coming to India from England, with so many things around, with so much to do, he started very concretely by establishing an organization called Bahishkrit Sabha in 1924, and 1927 he started a newspaper titled as the Bahishkrit Bharat. And on these two fronts, with these two instruments, he started raising the awareness of the people. He started creating the conditions for his future movement. So this period from 1923 to 1927 is a very critical period, not only in the life of Babasaheb Ambedkar, but also for the people. Because here a leader is preparing the masses through public education. Here is a leader who is trying to develop organizations. He is a leader who is trying to earn the living for himself. Here is a leader who is trying to be independent. Here is a leader who is wanting to devote fully to his society. Here is a leader who is facing hardships of life. Here is a leader whose family life is nothing but full of suffering. This is a very important period starting from 1923 to 1927.